me to do this presentation. So let's dive in. Um, as I assume that you're familiar, there are uh, some questions that surround assessment of student learning activities, institutional research in general, related to the IRB, because as we know, assessment of student learning and institutional research activities often use the methodology of research. And since it appears to involve the students typically and data about the students, one may assume that the projects that you're doing require IRB review. The IRB regulations are fairly clear about this, and we're going to sort of go over those regulations. So one of my first objectives is, let's see if I can get it to come up here. There we go. Is to provide you with a basic understanding of what the IRB is about. For many of you, if you've ever dealt with an IRB before, it might seem sort of like a black box. Where you have to do certain things and they come back and they ask you to do other things, etc. And it may not be entirely clear why they're asking for what they're asking and what the real basis of the process is. So I think it's always important for anybody involved in academia to have some idea of what the IRB is really about. Second, I want to provide an ethical argument based on the IRB regulations for why informed consent is not an absolute. This is, there certainly are instances where consent is not required. The IRB can waive the requirement for informed consent, and there are many other instances where projects don't even belong in the IRB to begin with. And my third objective is to give you some tools to help educate your IRBs about their proper roles and scope of authority. One of the biggest problems I see in talking to a number of IRBs, particularly in the social science side, they tend to overextend their authority. And they tend to often be based on, those decisions tend to be based on erroneous understandings, interpretations of the regulations. So I want to give you a little bit of ammunition, a little bit of understanding about the regulations so that you have a good idea what their proper role is. So part of my presentation is going to be about the sort of substance of student assessment and how it fits into the IRB. Part of my presentation is sort of about the regulations. Part of my presentation is about what the IRB is. And we're going to try to make those all fit together. So over the period of the course of the hour, hopefully this will coalesce for you as I'm trying to do several things at the same time here. So first of all, what's the purpose of an IRB? This is certainly the most important question to start with. And first of all, the purpose is not to harass investigators, although many investigators feel harassed by IRBs. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons for that harassment, the good reasons and the bad reasons. But its purpose is really not to harass investigators. The purpose of the IRB is not to rewrite your research. Although sometimes IRBs do that, sometimes they want to change your method, sometimes they want to rewrite your consent forms and things like that. We're going to talk about when that's appropriate, when it's not appropriate. The purpose of the IRB is not to prevent research from happening. Quite the contrary. The IRB should be there to promote research. And so even though it may appear to you that their job seems to be to prevent research, sometimes that's overreach by the IRB. Sometimes it's genuine concern for what its real purpose is. The purpose is not to provide a permission to publish research findings. This is probably the most common misconception about IRBs. There's for a couple of reasons, understanding out there that if you're planning on publishing something and it might involve human subjects, therefore you need IRB review. This is just not the case. Publication is not a category in the regulations. We'll talk about and look at why that misunderstanding has come about, but it's an important one to disabuse ourselves of. And the purpose is not to validate the importance of your research. Believe it or not, I've actually heard people say this, that they wanted to get IRB review because it made their research look more sort of legitimate, particularly those who might be working in new areas, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, and sort of want to have the aura of sort of the hard sciences. That's really not what it's about. The real purpose of the IRB is just this, to protect human subjects. That's really its fundamental goal. That's its only real goal. Everything feeds into that. So it's important to be clear that that's really what the IRB is about. And anything that doesn't really contribute to that probably doesn't need to be going on. So why do IRBs exist? Well, there's a sordid history, particularly in the domains of biomedical research, where the researcher has abused their privilege. The most famous case of this is the Tuskegee syphilis study. If you haven't read about this, there's some great books and resources out there on this study. Just in very short order, this was a study that followed a group of some 400 African American males with syphilis from the early 1930s up until the 1970s. And they did about everything wrong that you could do wrong in terms of protecting human subjects over that period of time. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it is important to understand that more than anything else in the history of research and of biomedical research, this study is the catalyst that led to the whole sort of regime of IRBs and the federal regulations. Couple of other studies of note, the Milgram experiment. If you don't know of Stanley Milgram at Yale, Google Stanley Milgram and you'll find out about his experiments. These were psychological experiments, fascinating stuff, but it turned out to cause some harm to people. Willowbrook and some other studies, there's a number of cases in which researchers, because they have knowledge and power over their patients, in some cases, patients who are either uneducated, maybe mentally disabled, or non-competent patients, have taken advantage of that power differential and conducted research that in some cases was harmful on those subjects without their knowledge, against their will, and so forth. And so in the 1970s, the early 1970s, when the Tuskegee syphilis study came to light officially in the press, Congress did something very unusual. They held hearings about this, and they said, we're really not competent to solve this problem. And can you imagine Congress today saying that? So the Congress, what they did is they appointed what's called a national commission. They were charged by legislation by Congress to develop, to study the problem of research involving human subjects and make recommendations, and those recommendations would then have to be turned into regulations by what was then the Department of Health Education and Welfare. And that's the source of the regulations. There's a number of anomalies with IRBs, and one of them is the fact that Congress sort of just turfed its responsibility. The regulations are not the result of just executive action. They were actually mandated by Congress to be written, although the contents of those obviously were up to the National Commission. Now, two things I want to point out regarding the National Commission. First, the National Commission issued a series of reports, one of which was the basis for the regulations that we have. The second, one of those reports that is really important is called the Belmont Report. And at the end of the slide presentation, I'll have a URL for you to go to the Belmont Report. If you never read anything else in this area, read the Belmont Report. It's about 15 pages. It has got some of the clearest statements of ethical principles you'll ever read anywhere. And it's just, it's quite a remarkable document. I assign it in all of my classes. I teach ethics because it's such a clear statement of just general ethical principles, in particular respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. The second thing I want to point out that's about the IRB process, because of this researcher privilege, the National Commission felt that it was important that there be some mechanism to ensure that there is no conflict of interest, and that the mechanism for review of research, which they recommended, which is the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, that their decisions not be manipulable by the institution itself. And so in our next slide here, I want to talk a little bit about the power of the IRB, because IRBs are very peculiar in this regard. The IRB is the only committee on campus or in the hospital, wherever the research institution, whatever it is, happens to be, whose decisions to not approve something cannot be appealed or overruled. Now, you can't, any other situation, ultimately, if it's a university, the Board of Trustees has authority. That authority is typically vested in the president, the chief academic officer, and so on. They make the final decisions. In this case, you have a committee typically composed of faculty, staff members, because you don't want the institution telling the IRB to approve things when it really, in its heart of hearts, believes that the research should not go forward. But on the other hand, that very power has led to some mission creep with IRBs, and people tend not to sort of question decisions of IRBs and so forth. And that's too bad, because IRBs haven't always respected the limits of their authority. So anyway, this idea that their decisions cannot be overruled is in the regulations. Research covered by this policy that's been approved by an IRB may be subject to further appropriate review and approval or disapproval by officials of the institution. However, those officials may not approve the research if it has not been approved by an IRB. So that's the evidence in the federal regulations. This obviously gives IRBs an inordinate amount of power, which I would argue and do argue that should be used judiciously and wisely. Unfortunately, it's not always the case that they do so. And so part of what I want to do today is give you some sense of what that power really ought to be doing and when it's overstepping that power, and maybe perhaps how to avoid IRBs overstepping that power. So I have 3 general rules for IRBs. So I'm just going to lay these out, and then we'll dive into the particulars. First, IRBs should exercise the least amount of oversight power in review of research as is consistent with the protection of human subjects in being promulgated by any federal agency. Actually represent a remarkably coherent sort of ethical framework. And when IRBs go beyond that framework, they need to do so explicitly and with the permission of their institutions. And otherwise, I think IRBs really need to stick to the letter of the regulations and not extend their oversight power beyond what is stipulated in those regulations, and obviously what protects human subjects. But the regulations do a very good job of protecting human subjects. And so I think anytime you go beyond the regulations, the IRBs really need to step back and think about what's their authority to do so. Second, IRBs should facilitate the research they review as much as possible. Research is good, and IRBs support research. So the IRB members really ought to be helping the investigators so that they understand the process, understand what's required, and do so in a way that minimizes the investigators' work as much as possible. So they really should be peers and not a sort of oversight board. Third, IRBs are supposed to be collegial ethical peer review committees. This is actually remarked upon by the National Commission when they looked at the committee structure that they wanted to embody going forward. The NIH had these peer review committees in place in the 60s, both to do ethical peer review as well, obviously, to do funding of research. And that's really their model, is ethical peer review. Unfortunately, for a couple of reasons, IRBs have become largely regulatory compliance and oversight bodies. This is due in part because of the FDA and their role in clinical trials and their particular take on the regulations. It's also due in part because of mission creep and due in part because of the enormous sums of money that can be at stake in compliance operations, and particularly with the IRB. So, but as much as possible, I push IRBs to think about themselves as peer review committees, less compliance and regulatory bodies, as much as possible. So, those are my sort of three principles that I think are important for IRBs. I want to now start with a little bit of perspective, because one of the roots, I think, of where IRBs go astray is the perspective they have on risk. So in general, there are two kinds of IRBs. There are biomedical IRBs, and these typically see high risk, high benefit research. These are that risk benefit judgment, all right? It requires knowledge and experience in terms of those risks and benefits. It's fascinating if you ever get a chance to sit in on a biomedical IRB. It's very fascinating to hear some really smart people who design the research and who are reviewing that research because they have, it's typically the clinicians who have the best handle on risk and benefit. And these IRBs, you're giving people drugs, you're looking at adverse events, you have all sorts of risks, but you also have the possibility of great benefit. And the second kind of IRB would be a social science IRB, which typically, though not exclusively, will see low risk, low benefit research. So this might be anything from anonymous surveys to counseling types of research, drug and alcohol abuse. Obviously, some of these things can be risky or be quite risky, but for the most part, social science IRBs see low risk and low benefit research. It's not to say that the research isn't good, it's just that the benefits to the subjects are typically quite small in social science research. You're generally using your subjects in this kind of research to get knowledge, but you're not necessarily doing anything that's going to help those subjects. It depends obviously on the research, whereas in biomedical research, typically you're doing interventions that do hold the promise of actually benefiting the research subjects. Now, what I want to highlight here, and certainly there are IRBs that do both of these, but an IRB that sees typically low risk research, their perspective on risk is very different than an IRB that sees high risk research. And in the absence of seeing genuinely high risk in research, I believe that some social science IRB members magnify the risks that they see in their research. The primary risk in social science research is breach of confidentiality. And that's certainly a risk in biomedical as well as social science types protocols. But as we'll see, that's a very particular kind of risk. And my feeling is that IRB members, if they would spend some time on biomedical IRBs, would be a lot more supportive of researchers and a lot less inclined to impose requirements on researchers that really aren't necessary in the social science domain. So given that perspective, I want to talk now about benefit and risk. I would be remiss to not bring this up. Generally, I'll spend a lot more time on this, certainly in a class or in working with an IRB and running in this research. And those risks get defined in sort of two dimensions: the magnitude of harm and the probability of harm, right? And when we say risk, we really mean both magnitude and probability. And obviously, you can have low magnitude harms that have high probabilities. You might get a headache from a drug, right, or from some activity, but that's a relatively low magnitude harm. On the other hand, you can have some very high magnitude harms, risk of heart attack, but they come in low probability of that benefit. And so what the Belmont report says in this regard is simply that risk-benefit assessments are concerned with the probabilities and magnitudes of possible harms and anticipated benefits. That's the primary job of the IRB, is to assess those, balance those. So just to give you a sort of visual representation, let's get my mouse in the right place. This would be a table of harms, and so you go to increasing probability to the right and increasing magnitude as you go down. So low probability, low magnitude is in the upper left, and you go down to high probability and high magnitude, just to sort of spread that out as a sort of matrix of risk. But of course, you have to consider risk relative to what benefit, right? Now, benefits, as we've already talked about, certainly concern the subjects who are participating in the research. And the first thing we want to look at is what's the balance of benefit to the subjects versus the risk. Obviously, if you have a disease, you're willing to put up with greater risks in order to realize greater benefits. If you are a healthy subject, you may not be willing to put up with greater risks or certain levels of risk, and certainly that's what the IRB does. But there's also another benefit to be considered in the risk-benefit calculation, and that's the benefit of the knowledge to be gained by the research. Because it doesn't make sense to put subjects at risk of harm if you're not producing good knowledge, if it's not knowledge that's going to change practice in some way. Now, I'm going to couch that in terms of the question, what is the IRB's responsibility with regard to the scientific validity of the study? So when an IRB looks at research, it needs to do that risk-benefit calculation relative to the subjects themselves, but it also has to ask, are the risks to the subjects commensurate to the possible knowledge gained? Now, that doesn't mean that for the sake of knowledge, we're going to put subjects at risk. We always have to make sure that subjects have a commensurate benefit relative to the risk that they experience. But if we are going to put subjects at risk, we ought to be sure that we're generating good knowledge. Now, the regulations themselves are silent about this question. The regulations don't tell us what the IRB's responsibility with regard to the scientific validity of the study is. But they do say the following. Risks to subjects are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits, if any, to subjects, and the importance of the knowledge that may reasonably be to be gained. Right? Now, generally speaking, as risks increase, so does the scrutiny of the scientific merits. And if you go to this site, the OHRP, Office for Human Research into Scientific Merits, as the risks increase. Now, the reason why this is important, particularly in the context to evaluate for assessment purposes. If those risks are so low as to be non-existent or minimal or easily handled of your study, right? And we know that assessment, it's even though it's been around for 20, 25 years, its methods are still sometimes kind of mushy. Sometimes they're good enough. Certainly there are assessment projects that have done with great scientific rigor. If you look at something like the Wabash study, you got some serious psychometricians there who have developed some assessment tools that are very rigorous. But certainly for assessment of student learning outcomes, the use of rubrics and so forth, these are going to give us, these are pretty blunt instruments. They're not going to give us fine-grained data. As you'll see, it's not even clear that what we're doing there is actual research as defined by the regulations. The risks are minimal. It's really not the place of the IRB to be intervening and saying, well, your method here, your researcher is viewed as rewriting researchers' protocols. They step in and they sometimes want to change the methodology to make it more rigorous. And that's only appropriate when there's risk to subjects. If there aren't risks to subjects, certainly they can provide some advice, but they shouldn't hold up protocols on the basis of that. So this is one sort of pain point that you may have experienced with your IRB, and so it's worthwhile trying to help educate your IRB about what their proper role is relative to the scientific merits of the research. Now, there's another benefit that's related to scientific benefit, and that is social benefit. And this is interesting. The regulations explicitly rule out consideration of social benefits. Now, by social benefit, what they don't mean is that the knowledge will be beneficial in some clinical context. Rather, what they mean is, and here's the statement from the regulations, the IRB should not consider possible long-range effects of applying knowledge gained in the research. For example, the possible effects of the research on public policy as among those research risks that fall within the purview of its responsibility. So I had a call from an IRB a couple months ago, an IRB coordinator, and the chair of the IRB was giving her a hard time because actually it wasn't the IRB coordinator, it was the institutional research director. And she was getting a hard time from the IRB passing some of the standardized surveys that they do with their students because they were asking the students to self-identify on those surveys so that when they got that data back, they could actually recontact those students and perhaps address issues and needs that they identified in the surveys. And this is all voluntary. The IRB chair didn't like the sort of big brother approach that the Institutional Research Office was taking relative to the students. That would be an analogous example to this phrase here in the regulations of an IRB looking at the social implications of a research activity and passing judgments on that research activity based on the social implications. So, a real clear example is if you were going to do research that was connected in some way to abortion, whether or not that research would lead to more or fewer abortions in the long run is not something that the IRB is allowed to consider. So this is another place where you can run into a little bit of problem with the IRB. So, given that background, let's look at what the activities are that IRBs evaluate. So the regulations are very clear. What IRBs do is, or actually the regulations say here that the policy, the regulations themselves, apply to all research involving human subjects. Now, I'm not going to talk about the hooks that the federal government uses to get research that's not funded by the federal government reviewed by IRB. So I'm going to pass on that one. So we're just going to leave it as that blanket statement, all research involving human subjects. So the first question that the IRB has is it research? And this is from the Belmont report. The term research designates an activity designed to test an hypothesis, permit conclusions to be drawn, and a formal protocol that sets forth an objective, a set of procedures, etc. So that's the Belmont report, and from the regulations themselves, this is the definition. So this is the regulatory definition in the regulations. Research means a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and that this term generalizable knowledge is the sticking point. What does it mean that it's generalizable? And so this is two different drugs is designed to generate generalizable knowledge. But on the margin, but research as defined by the regulations is what the IRB has to look at. Has to be a systematic investigation. If in the Q&A you can respond to. It's a little bit odd, in the webinar situation here, but you'll notice that the definition of research, which is defined as generalizable knowledge, does not refer to publication. And many IRBs, many researchers view the threshold for IRB review as if you intend to publish your results. And here's the problem with that definition. It's certainly possible to put proxy for generalizable knowledge is a bad practice. It's a bad habit. Now, on the other hand, it tends to give one a handle on what's meant by generalizable knowledge. And certainly if you're publishing something, you want to make sure that you're protecting any subjects who may be in the background depending on the nature of the project that you're working on. Another reason why publication has come into our lexicon in defining generalizable knowledge is that back in the 90s, the journal editors, mostly the biomedical journal editors, but then a number of journal editors beyond the biomedical sciences adopted this rule. They said that if there are any human subjects involved, you have to have IRB approval for your project or we won't publish. And it's that linking between publication in journals and IRB approval that has caused us to confuse publication with generalizable knowledge. That's a great rule. It's a great way to capture activities that should have been reviewed by IRBs but were not because of the holes in the regulations. But on the other hand, it contributes to this assumption that publication is a proxy for generalizable knowledge, and it simply is not. The word publication does not appear in the regulations except when it refers to the publication of the regulations themselves in the Federal Register. So this is a resource that you can check out when you get the slides. If you want to follow up on these, you can certainly follow up on these, and you can see that what OHRP's guidance is on this definition. All right, so I have some examples here. Are these research? So the CAP test is an area test, kind of a standardized test to see how your students are doing relative to national benchmarks in certain majors. If you want to quick type in and make a vote whether you think this is research as defined by the regulations, or if not, I'll just give you a quick second, and if you don't have nobody wants to hazard a guess here. So this is an interesting example from the institution's point of view. If we implement the CAP test for a given group of majors at an institution, what we're interested in finding out is how well our students are doing relative to some national norm, because the CAP test is a standardized test. That's not knowledge that is generalizable. That our students are operating at a certain level relative to the national norm is information about our institution. It's information that we use to improve the quality of our practices, our educational practices at our institution. But it's not generalizable knowledge that our average score of our students in some major is, 3.5, whatever the scale happens to be, right? Doesn't tell anybody else about how they ought to be operating, right? Now, if we did a randomized trial and put students into two different curricular programs in the same major, say, and then gave them the CAP test, and then we took those results as a way to evaluate the effectiveness of those two different curricular programs, then we've got research. Now that's something that other institutions can say, oh, I should use this pedagogical method or this curricular program because it's more effective, right? Now, you may only have an institution of one that may not be quite enough to generalize, but you get the idea. Now, if you're the people who designed the CAP test and you want to test the psychometric validity of questions on your test, you might be doing research by sticking those questions into the test, having them answered by students across the country at various institutions, and then evaluating those results. That might be research as well. So the same activity could be research from the point of view of the test company and not research from the point of view of the institution. So let's go to the next one. Applying rubrics to random samples of student work. I hazard a guess here that because you're on this webinar, you might have been involved in this sort of work. Would this be research as defined by the regs? I guess I don't have any volunteers here yet. So if you do, you can certainly type in your response. So again, this is a quality improvement process. Fairfield University meet the Fairfield University faculty's expectations. Doesn't say anything about how students at Indiana University are meeting their expectations, right? So it's really quality improvement. This is not research. It's not generalizable. Now, as Chris, do you remember? It's not the Visions Project. It's Gosh, it's terrible that I just forgot this. But anyway, AAC have involved research in testing those rubrics against different samples of student work across different institutions with different raters. And so those surveys of student engagement. Again, this is about improving our institutional effectiveness. The data may or may not be engaged in research, but on campus here, conducting these surveys, it's primarily for quality improvement. Student evaluations of teaching, this is not research at all. This is straight old just evaluation, quality improvement again. An investigation by the student newspaper of student cheating on campus. This looks like research. It uses research methods. They might even do a survey. But we have to remember that the federal regulation, journalism is just basically off limits to the IRB. We should not be asking journalism projects to go before the IRB. Sometimes the purpose of an article in a newspaper is actually to harm somebody. That is to point out that somebody's doing something wrong, which obviously harms their interests. And to have an IRB step in and say, how are you going to protect the crooks that you're investigating just doesn't make sense. So journalism in general just is exempted. It just should never appear before the IRB. Cross-institutional assessment, I believe that you folks may be involved in some of this work. Again, applying rubrics to student work or sharing data from standardized tests. Again, typically what you're trying to do is benchmark your students as well as develop a shared sort of set of expectations for those students across institutions. But you're typically not doing research in the strict sense as defined by the regs. So, as we pointed out earlier, the IRB, what it does is look at research involving human subjects. So now we need to know what a human subject is. And that's the nice thing about being a philosopher is you get to ask very basic questions like this. So human subjects means a living individual. So they have to be living. If they're dead, they're not a human subject. So dead person's data and so forth is not part of the IRB's concern. But it has to be a living individual about whom an investigator, whether professional or student, conducting research obtains data through intervention or interaction with that individual. So you're doing something to that person or interacting with that person in some way. Or identifiable private information. So it's certainly possible to get identifiable private information without interacting with somebody, right? That is the subject. So I could go to Banner and run a query and get a list of students with a certain range of grades and certain set of courses, right? That's private identifiable information. So therefore, I would be involving human subjects in my research. So private information, there has to be a reasonable expectation that the information will not be made public, and private information means that it must be individually identifiable. So if you have a name, obviously that's identifiable. If you have a student ID number, that's identifiable. Links to identifiers, links to names, social security numbers, etc. Will constitute private information. So in order for it to be non-private information, it has to be stripped of all links and to identifiers and identifiers. Now, one of the problems, particularly with big data, is that if you have a sufficiently rich data set, all of the data points that you have may be sufficient to uniquely identify the person. Generally, IRBs haven't dealt with that problem too much unless they're looking at very sensitive data. So, for instance, if you have the zip code and neighborhood of HIV patients, then you might actually be able to identify those individuals. And certainly, depending on how granular your data is, you can identify individuals, recover their names very, very easily if you have access to the right data sets. So let's ask another set of questions here. Is it a human subject? Review of anonymous transcripts. In this case, it's anonymous data. It's therefore not a human subject. Now, again, those transcripts may be sufficiently granular that if you're good enough with your SQL, with your data, you could match it up. The likelihood of being able to match that up for any typical researcher looking at transcripts is pretty small, because you need to have direct access to the database or and so forth to be able to run the query that would match everything up. But in general, anonymous transcripts, that's not a human subject. The IRB doesn't need to be involved. Reading identified student papers, yes, that's a human subject because you've got identifiers on the papers. So you are dealing with a human subject in that case. Genetic analyses of anonymous tissue samples. This is an example. I threw this in because it's an example of granularity of data. It turns out that your genome is a unique identifier, as everybody knows. And so if you have somebody's tissue samples, it's really hard to argue nowadays that they're anonymous. It may not be easy to match them back up, but with the advent, the widespread adoption now of electronic medical records in hospitals, they're starting to include genetic information in there. Pretty soon there's not going to be any such thing as anonymous tissue samples. Analysis of videotapes pulled from security cameras. This is an interesting one. So it's a public area. There's no de facto expectation of privacy. And so therefore, you could argue that analyzing these videotapes in a public area such as a campus center is not private identifiable information because there's no expectation of privacy in that setting. Now, there certainly could be security cameras in settings where there is privacy expectation. So you have to be clear about what the I see that Chris is giving me a message here. Make sure that you have Q&A set to presenter view to see the responses. Let's try that. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Chris. Now I see that some of you did vote, and I wish I had seen that back when we were doing that. I apologize. Yeah, Gloria, thank you. So it's the value rubrics, and it's LEAP, yes. So anyway, if you ask questions now, I'll be able to answer them because I'll be able to see them. I apologize for that. Thank you, Chris. All right, so I think we got one more here. Let's see. Nope. Why am I not getting on? Oh, that's interesting. You just nixed my arrows, Chris. So all right, well, I'll use the mouse. All right, so reading anonymous student papers. This is not a human subject because there's no identifier to the student, to the paper. So it's not a human subject, and therefore the regulations don't apply, and therefore IRB review is not required. Right, so most of your assessment projects involve anonymous student work. Most of it is simply outside the scope of the IRB. So there's a vast amount of assessment activities, assessment of student learning, a direct assessment of student learning that probably just should never come to the IRB because it's not a human subject that you're dealing with. And even if it were a human subject, we'll see there's a vast area of activities and education that are exempt, which we're going to get to shortly. All right, so one final definition from the regulations, minimal risk. That definition is, minimal risk means the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. So a doctor's visit, just standard physical exam, is minimal risk. A blood draw, a needle in your vein to pull out blood, is minimal risk. Psychological examinations, minimal risk. Now, what I want to pull out of this is something that's a little bit tangential to this definition, but it's something that's overlooked quite often. And that is that when you go to your physician for a physical exam, obviously there's some private information that you're going to divulge. The physician is going to examine all of your body, not just parts of it. And so there's certainly private stuff that's going on there and information that is private that needs to be protected, that is confidential, right? But the regulations define minimal risk as the risk of breach of confidentiality in a physical exam. What that means is that confidentiality is not a risk that rises above minimal in most circumstances. Now, there are certain circumstances where that data may be particularly sensitive. Many states have treated HIV status as particularly sensitive. Certainly, drug and alcohol use information might be particularly sensitive. But in general, confidentiality is not a research risk. That is, it's not a risk that results from how you interact or intervene with your subjects. Rather, it's a risk that the regulations consider minimal because the regulations expect that the researchers are always going to protect confidentiality. The regulations have a section on confidentiality. I'm not going to go into it today, but it's an expectation. And certainly, those of us in education, we have expectations about confidentiality of student information. We're subject to FERPA and so forth. And so, the National Commission, when they looked at this issue, and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, when they wrote the regulations, decided that confidentiality is simply a given that we expect that you will protect confidentiality, and thus having private identifiable information isn't necessarily risk that rises above minimal. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So we're going to now turn to a ethical principle, our second ethical principle. We talked about beneficence. We're going to talk here about respect for persons, because respect for persons is the foundation for informed consent. It's one of the foundations for informed consent. So this is from the Belmont report. Respect for persons incorporates at least two ethical convictions. First, that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, that is, they're free to make their own decisions. And second, that persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection, right? So if you have somebody who's mentally disabled or is non-competent or incompetent to make their own decisions, we need to protect those people, take special measures to protect them. But for the competent folks, those who are free and rational, we need to respect their decisions. So, to respect autonomy is to give weight to an autonomous person's considered opinions and choices while refraining from obstructing their actions unless they are clearly detrimental to others. So this is a general definition of autonomy, of respect for autonomy. The takeaway from this definition is the following. This is a principle of non-interference. What it means is don't do things to people without their permission. Don't interfere with them without their permission. And so that's the basis of our idea of informed consent, or at least the consent part of informed consent, is that we ask people permission before we involve them in our research projects. Now, you'll notice that the definition says to give weight to autonomous persons' considered opinions. It doesn't say that this is an absolute always requirement, but certainly when we are intervening with individuals, interacting with individuals in certain ways, certainly when we're putting them at risk, then we need to ask their permission. When we're not putting them at risk, then the rules may be a little bit different in terms of the need to ask them their permission or to give them full informed consent, as it were. So to highlight that fact, I want to call your attention not to the part of the regs that define informed consent. I recommend that you look at the regs if you're interested in all the elements of informed consent. What I'm interested in here is the waiver of informed consent. So let's say you've got a research project. It's research. It involves human subjects. We're going to get to the exemption criteria in just a minute. But let's say it's not exempt. But let's say that there's some reason why asking the informed consent of your subjects would tarnish your data, would bias your data. Well, the regulations provide for the opportunity to waive informed consent. So there's 4 criteria that must be met. First, it has to be minimal risk. So if it meets the criteria, the definition of minimal risk, then you have the possibility of waiving informed consent. It's the third criteria here that's the most important. The second one is actually just a rehash of what the regulations are about. But the third one is the key. The research could not practically be carried out without the waiver or alteration. So for instance, if you wanted to look at the sample, the next 5,000 cases of some disease from the electronic medical record database, right? Your ability to get consent is very attenuated in that circumstance. You simply don't have the time, the money, the personnel, etc., to go and get consent from all of these patients. It may be perfectly reasonable for the IRB to say, look, this is minimal risk. You're going to strip the identifiers. We will grant a waiver of informed consent, because if we don't, you're not going to be able to do the research. Now, the ethical lesson I want to take from this is that informed consent is not an absolute. There are conditions in which it can be waived. There are conditions in which it's not productive, particularly when the research is minimal risk and you're not directly intervening or interacting with the individuals, the subjects. It's not clear what value the informed consent process has. So one thing I want to point out here in the next slide is what this suggests is that there is a balancing of respect for persons versus the benefits of research. And when the risks are minimal, then respecting persons, that is informed consent, is not an absolute obligation. So this is the sort of ethical argument that that I'm trying to make here, that consent is not always required, and certainly in the case of much of the research or the projects that you work on in terms of assessment of student learning, consent may not be required. And so we'll talk about that here in just a second. So I want to now turn to the exemption categories. There are three that I want to highlight here, and I see we're coming up on the top of the hour, so we'll probably go about 5 minutes over, and then we'll have time for questions, so hopefully you can bear with us. Educational practices. So if what you're doing is research and involves human subjects, but you're doing educational research, chances are you can fit your project into this exemption category. So the regs provide a set of categories of research activities involving human subjects that are exempted from the regulations, and that means exempt from the IRB review. So research conducted in established or commonly accepted educational settings involving normal educational practices, such as research on regular and special educational instructional strategies, or research on the effectiveness or comparison among instructional techniques, curricula, or classroom management methods. As far as I can tell, almost every assessment of student learning project I've ever seen fits this category. And so it's exempt. And what exempt means is that the IRB shouldn't be reviewing it, that it's not under the purview of the IRB. Doesn't mean that IRBs aren't going to say that you have to be reviewed, because it depends on each IRB, but in general, they should not be reviewing this kind of research. Now, I'll come back to the question here in just a minute of who decides whether what you're doing is exempt. And I will certainly make the argument the IRB ought to make that decision, but they should be making the decision that they shouldn't be reviewing your research if it fits the exemption categories. So the second exemption category, if you don't fit that one, surveys, interviews, tests. So research involving the use of educational tests, survey procedures, interview procedures, observation of public behavior is exempt unless, and you have to meet both of these categories. So if you obtain the information, record the information such that you have identifiers, and disclosure of that information could put the subjects at risk of criminal, civil liability, damaging to the reputation, etc. So if you have identifiers and it's sensitive information, and you're doing surveys, interviews, observation of public behavior, etc., then the project is not exempt. Just doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that it's not exempt, and that the IRB will want to review it. It doesn't mean that you can't waive informed consent. You have to make the case then. Now, there is an important caveat for this exemption category, and that is the exemption for research involving survey or interview procedures or observations of public behavior does not apply to research apply to research involving children. So the subpart here is referring to children. So if they're under 18, then the surveys and observation of public behavior does not apply. It's not exempt. It has to go through the IRB review. So certainly in the college setting, you can have freshmen who are under 18, and so you may want to exclude them because otherwise you have to make the case either to waive informed consent or you have to get parental consent because that's the requirement for children. So that's kind of a sticky problem with the regulations. Finally, there is an exemption category for what I call existing stuff. So if you're collecting or studying existing data, documents, records, etc., provided that you don't record the identifiers when you record your data, then you're exempt and the IRB doesn't need to be looking at your research. So you've got 3 exemption categories. So we'll just to summarize, educational practices, individually identified test data, surveys, etc., as long as it's not harmful, obviously anonymous test data and surveys, and publicly available information, or information that you collect that is not where you don't record the identifier. Now, who decides what is exempt? Now, the regulations don't actually say how this decision should be made. The institution has to come up with some method for making this decision. The institution is the one that's responsible for assuring that the research is compliant with the regulations. So it follows that the IRB should make this determination based on an adequate understanding of the research in question. What that means typically is that you're going to have to submit some form of protocol to your IRB in order to get them to sign off and say that it's exempt. Some IRBs require that you would submit protocols so that they can decide whether it's research or not, or whether it involves human subjects or not, so they treat those definitional categories as exemption categories. In general, this is good practice because presumably the IRB has a better idea about the meaning of these regulations than do any old investigator who comes along who probably hasn't read them to begin with or has only done a cursory read. So now, that doesn't mean that IRBs are always good at interpreting these regulations. They tend to mission creep, and they tend to overextend their reach. And so part of what I'm hoping to do today is to help you, give you some information that you can educate your IRBs. So this is a matter of policy, who decides what is exempt. And there's a number of IRBs out there that don't really have guiding policy, and they should. And IRB policy should really be determined by the institution, not just by the IRB. So bottom line, is consent necessary for assessment? In general, from the IRB's perspective, most of these kinds of projects are either exempt from IRB review or they're outside the scope of the authority of the IRB. IRB review does not add any protection to the students whose work is evaluated. Frankly, if you're collecting student work, whether it's anonymous or not, it's not clear to me that having the IRB's oversight and the heavy hammer of the possibility of IRB disapproval is going to really do anything to protect the human subjects that are there, the students. You're already bound by FERPA. You're already bound by standard practices in education to protect confidentiality of students. I just think IRBs really need to spend their time working on projects that present genuine risk to subjects. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't find a project, an assessment project, that might in fact present risk to subjects. Certainly you could be collecting student journals, and then now you're getting personal confessions and all sorts of stuff and things like that. So you do have to pay attention to what you're doing. But in general, these assessment projects just don't rise to the level of risk that merits IRB review. Written informed consent doesn't add any protection to the student whose work is evaluated. It adds work for the investigators. It doesn't do anything particularly for the students, as far as I can see. If you want to go ahead of your own accord and get informed consent, I've heard some English professors say that it tells the students that we're valuing their intellectual property, that we, and so forth. That's a matter of conscience. You can do so. But the IRB shouldn't be the ones that are determining that for you when it's exempt, when it's not research, and so forth. In general, I think it's a good idea to notify students, when they come in the doors, first day of class, their freshman year experience, whatever it is, that, we as an institution work to improve our student learning. And so we look at your work, we evaluate your work. If you really want to opt out, you can talk to your professor and, opt out and so forth. So I think blanket consent, a blanket opt-out option, I think, is probably sufficient for the level of risk that we're looking at, which is really quite minimal. Now, I want to turn to one more question because this gets at the issue of mission creep, and then we'll be done. We got just 2 more slides. So who sets IRB policy? The regulations are silent on this matter. The regulations don't say who should write IRB policy. My recommendation is that the IRB should not set its own policy. IRBs have done this de facto simply by overextending their reach in various ways without ever committing that to a set of standard policies, standard operating procedures. Most hospitals and FDA-regulated IRBs will have standard operating procedures. Most big institutions will have them. IRBs at smaller institutions often do not. So it's important that you have a set of standard operating procedures that define how the IRB is going to operate through all of these things that I've been talking about. Left to their own devices, IRBs tend towards mission creep. Policy should be set by the institution, that is the faculty and the administration, through whatever governance procedures you have, obviously in consultation with the IRB. IRBs might be the ones to help write the standard operating procedures and the general framework that guides IRB operations. But really the faculty needs to be involved because there's obvious issues of academic freedom here. No other case can the institution step into the middle of somebody's research and shut them down or tell them how to do their research. And so we have to be very careful that we respect academic freedom. And the best way we do that is by using our governance procedures to make sure that the IRBs are doing what they ought to do. So the institutional's role is to set IRB policy. They cannot overturn IRB denial of approval, but they can deny permission to an IRB-approved protocol. I've actually seen that happen in a hospital before. But that's generally the institutional's role. So that brings us to the end. These are some resources. This presentation will be available for you to download. If you don't read anything else, the Belmont Report is the thing to read. It's a great read. It's clear. It's concise. And it's really the ethical framework for all protection of human subjects in research. So you've all stayed on throughout the hour. So and nobody asked questions. I'm surprised. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and type them in. I'm happy to hang out on the webinar here and entertain any questions that you have. Again, you'll be able to get these from download of the PowerPoint. So you don't need to sit and scribble those down now. If you would like to ask questions directly of me rather than through the webinar, this is my email address. Please feel free to email questions. I'm happy to give you a little bit of guidance for what it's worth. Help you deal with your particular IRB problems. But if you have any questions that you'd like to share with the audience, I'd be happy to read those back and give you my 2 cents worth. If you don't have questions, or maybe you're all waiting for somebody to ask, oh, we got a question, Beth, thank you. Oh, well, okay. I appreciate the compliment. It wasn't a question, darn it. But I appreciate the. She said you were very informative, so I appreciate that. Um, if you don't have questions, and you can certainly sign off at this point, and I will hang out here and see if anybody does come up with questions.
Thanks, Kurt.
I think I hear Chris in the background. Yeah.
If you're forgetting how to ask a question, you just type it into that little white box at the bottom of the Q&A window. I also wanted to say, if you had any questions about the collaborative, we don't have anybody else on the webinar from the collaborative today, but if you send an email to that address where you received your webinar invitation, we'd be happy to get that to the right person for you also.
I think they're all waiting for somebody else to ask a question. It's just like students. They're probably all sitting in the back of the room, too. I guess I shouldn't harass my audience too much. Ruth has a question. Oh, here it is. Do I click on it, Chris? Yes, to get the full view.
To see the full question. Yep.
All right. I can't quite see it. Hang on just a second. I have to adjust my window panes over here so that I can see the whole question. So I'll get to it here. Okay. So there we go. So my question is, should we present this collaborative project to our IRB? That, I think it would be a matter of your institutional policy. You're sending in presumably student work to the collaborative project to be evaluated, and I don't know a lot of the details about the collaborative project across the states. I know a little bit more about what's going on in Massachusetts, having worked with them on this project, but my guess is that you're really not doing research. And I'm almost certain that you would be submitting anonymized student work. So it's de-identified, so it's not even human subjects. So in that case, you're really not doing research involving human subjects, and so it just falls outside the scope of the regulations. Now, your IRB may be the ones that want to make that determination. You're in a kind of peculiar situation here because you're contributing student work to a broader project that involves other institutions and so forth. The safe bet would be to provide a brief enough explanation to your IRB that explains what the project is, makes it clear that this is de-identified student work, and so that therefore you think it's not even human subjects. And then they can write back with a letter and say, yeah, you're right, this is outside the IRB's scope of authority, and they'll give you a letter to that effect. That can be useful should you ever want to write write an article about this process. A journal editor may ask you for that letter, and that's all you need. So it's always best to do that prospectively rather than retrospectively. That is, do it ahead of time rather than when you need it after you've done the work. But you're certainly not putting your institution in any jeopardy by proceeding without IRB review, because it's very clear that it's outside the scope of the regs. But again, the IRB may have its rules that they're the ones who make that decision. So, a quick call to your IRB chair or IRB coordinator, say, here's what we're doing, and and they may just ask for some abstract information. I try to tell IRBs to ask for as little as possible to make these determinations. There's no reason to have to go through a whole protocol submission, but that's sort of up to them. All right, I see Beth has a question, and hopefully that answered your question, Ruth. Beth has a question. So you can get, just to clarify, post-secondary education options students who are under the age of 18 must have parental permission to participate. That is not, no, that's not the case. So if you've got students under 18, you are required to have IRB review only if you're doing tests. Let's see if I can get back to the appropriate place. This is just let me get there. Coming up, here it is. So the exemption at 101B2 regarding educational tests is also applicable to this subpart. However, the exemption for research involving survey or interview procedures So if you are doing interviews or surveys of students under the age of 18, it is not exempt, and therefore the protocol has to go to the IRB. The IRB may decide to waive the requirement for informed consent. That's within its discretion. What you would have to do is demonstrate that you could not practically carry out the project without that waiver. Now, if you're collecting student work from this group of students, these students under the age of 18, and you've got a sample set, say, of 30 or 50 students, probably you can get parental consent. So the IRB may say, no, you have to get consent, and so therefore you have to do a regular protocol and have a consent form. And typically what you would have is an assent form for the student and the consent form from the parent. Again, that makes life difficult for you, I know, because getting the students to do what you want them to do is hard enough, but then getting them to get their parents to do what you want them to do is even harder. But unfortunately, the difficulty of getting people to sign consent forms and get them back is not a criteria for the waiver of informed consent. So it really has to be that you can't do the research without the waiver. So if that's a clearly defined group of students that you're working with, certainly you're going to, and you're doing surveys and or interviews, then you're going to need to go through IRB process. On the other hand, if what you're doing is assessment of student learning, applying rubrics to student papers, that's not a survey, that's not a test. And so that it could still be exempt under the educational exemption, exemption number 1. So keep in mind that these exemption categories are hierarchical. So if you meet exemption 1, exemption 2 doesn't matter, and the caveat in exemption 2 doesn't matter. So you can be doing tests in an standard educational setting, and it would be exempt. It's when you're doing testing and interviews outside of the standard educational setting that you're not exempt. So it's a little bit complicated, but so hopefully that answers your question. You can see why typically IRBs should be the ones to make these determinations, because there's a lot of sort of if-then logic that goes on in terms of how these exemptions apply. Did that answer your question? Oh, you said thank you. Appreciate it. Good, good. Are there other questions? Again, feel free to contact me directly if you have questions. I always find it interesting to find out how other institutions' IRBs work and what the issues are that people have. I've worked with a number of IRBs over the years, so it's sort of an interesting side of the institution. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, I thank you for your participation today. I hope this was informative for you. The slides I know will be available. Chris can give you more information on that, and I guess a recording of today's session will be available as well. So I wish you luck in your assessment endeavors and the LEAP project, and best of luck to you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Yeah, on the SHIELD website, on our Multi-State Collaborative page, you'll find links to the webinar recordings and PowerPoints and all that stuff, and it'll coming up in the next few days. So thanks, everybody, for coming, and have a great evening.